On the morning of March 9, 2021, a young man swung a sledgehammer into the wall of an old Ohio farmhouse and stopped a town's heart. Tyler Rusk and his wife Megan had bought the abandoned Brant farm at auction 5 months earlier. They were renovating the summer kitchen at the back of the house, tearing out a century of plaster and lath, when the north wall cracked open and something pale slid out of the cavity and landed at Tyler's feet. It was a human skull. Behind it, folded into the darkness between the studs, were more bones, scraps of denim, and one small object that would undo 3 decades of grief. A charm bracelet, a tiny brass sparrow. 2 miles down County Road 9, in a farmhouse kitchen that had not changed since the first George Bush was president, a 79-year-old woman named Ruth Hartman was drinking her coffee alone. She had spent 32 years waiting for a knock on her door. Her daughter Laura was 17 when she vanished on that same road on October 14, 1988, riding her blue bicycle home from work in the last gray light of an autumn afternoon. No struggle, no scream, no trace. The bicycle was found leaning against the Brant fence line as gently as if she had parked it herself. And then nothing, for 32 years, until a sledgehammer went through a wall, less than 100 yards from where her bike was found. When the sheriff's car finally pulled into Ruth's driveway that afternoon, she watched it through the window and felt her whole body go still. She told herself she was ready. She had rehearsed this moment for 3 decades, the moment they finally brought Laura home. The deputy stood on her porch with his hat in his hands and said the words she had waited half a lifetime to hear. "We found remains." And Ruth Hartman, who had buried her husband without answers, who had baked a birthday pie every June 3rd for a daughter who never came to eat it, began to plan her child's funeral at last. But the bones inside that wall were about to tell a story that no one in Harlow Creek, Ohio had ever imagined. Not the sheriff who worked the case until it broke him, not the town that spent 16 years pointing at the wrong man, not the mother who thought the worst thing left to learn was where her daughter's body lay, because the remains sealed inside the Brant farmhouse were not Laura Hartman. And what investigators found folded into that wall beside them, a bracelet, a matchbook, and a dead man's secret, would lead them across 3 states and 3 decades to a quiet street in North Carolina, and to a phone call placed at 11:40 at night by a woman who had been hiding in plain sight since 1988. This is the story of a disappearance that evaporated a girl from a country road in broad daylight, of a family that lived 3 decades inside the crushing weight of not knowing, of an innocent man destroyed by whispers while the truth sat sealed in his own kitchen wall, and of a lie so cruel, so perfectly aimed at a 17-year-old heart, that it kept a living daughter away from her mother's door for more than half her life. Before we continue with this shocking story, subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss any case, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We want to know where our community is tonight. Now let's go back to the beginning, back to Harlow Creek, Ohio, in the autumn of 1988, when the corn was coming down and a stranger had just arrived at the Brant farm. Harlow Creek, Ohio, sat in farm country an hour southwest of Cleveland, population 2,101 traffic light. A grain elevator that was the tallest thing for 10 miles. A Methodist church, a diner, and Yoder's Market on the square. The kind of town where farmers left their keys in their trucks, where everyone knew whose dog was loose on the road, where nothing bad had happened in living memory, and everyone intended to keep it that way. The Hartman place lay 2 miles east of town on County Road 9, 300 acres of corn and soybeans that Elmer Hartman worked the way his father had worked them before him. Elmer was 49, a big quiet man with hands like fence posts and a soft spot he only showed his daughter. His wife Ruth was 46, kept the books part-time at the grain elevator, sang alto in the church choir, and ran her household on routines that held the family together like good fence wire. Sunday dinner after church, Saturday morning pancakes, a pie every birthday, made from scratch. Their only child was Laura Jean Hartman, born on June 3, 1971, 17 years old that fall, a junior at Harlow Creek High. Brown hair she wore in a braid down her back, gray-green eyes, 5'4" in her white sneakers. She wanted to be a veterinarian. Not the kind with a little office full of poodles, she liked to say, but a real large animal vet, the kind who drives out at 2 in the morning to save a calf. She had the grades for Ohio State, and a shoebox, where she saved every paycheck from her after-school job stocking shelves at Yoder's Market. On her 16th birthday, Elmer had melted down an old brass harness buckle in his shop and shaped it into a tiny sparrow and hung it on a chain bracelet for her wrist. Because she was always going to fly away from him someday, he said. She never took it off. Laura rode a blue Schwinn bicycle the 2 miles between the farm and town every school day, past the fence line of the Brandt place. Amos Brandt was 55 that year, a bachelor farmer who lived alone in the white farmhouse his grandfather had built in 1904. He had a stutter that had made his school years a misery, and somewhere along the way he had simply stopped talking to people. He waved from his tractor. He paid his bills. He kept to himself, and the town, in the way of small towns, kept a polite distance and told stories about him. That September, with the harvest coming on and his back giving out, Amos did something he rarely did. He hired help. The man's name was Carl Dean Jessup. He was 37, a harvest hand from Indiana, who drifted from farm to farm with the seasons, a footlocker, and a quiet, polite way about him that made farmers trust him with their equipment. Amos gave him the back room off the summer kitchen and never thought to ask for more than a day's work. Nobody in Harlow Creek looked twice at Carl Jessup. Hired men came and went every harvest. But Carl had a habit no one noticed. In the evenings, when the light went long and gold across the fields, he would stand in the farm lane with a cigarette and watch the road. And every evening, at almost exactly the same time, a girl on a blue bicycle came pedaling past the fence, braid swinging, sparrow bracelet catching the last of the sun. He learned her schedule the way a farmer learns weather, quietly, patiently, day after day. The Hartmans never knew he existed. They had no way of knowing that the season's most ordinary decision, one aging farmer hiring one quiet stranger, had already set a clock ticking on the road between their daughter and home. Friday, October 14th, 1988, came in warm and gray, the air heavy with the smell of rain that hadn't fallen yet, and corn dust from the fields coming down all over the county. Laura went to school, passed a math quiz, and traded notes with her boyfriend Danny Kowalski about the homecoming dance 2 weeks away. After the last bell, she worked her shift at Yoder's Market, stocking canned goods and carrying groceries out for old Mrs. Pfeiffer, who would remember for the rest of her life that Laura had laughed at her joke about the price of coffee. At 5:15 in the afternoon, Laura clocked out. She pulled on her red and black flannel jacket, swung her canvas school bag over her shoulder, and pushed her blue Schwinn off the square. At 5:20, the pastor's wife saw her pass the Methodist church and waved. Laura waved back. At 5:26, a school bus driver heading into town saw her pedaling east on County Road 9, braid swinging, 2 miles from home. He was the last person who ever admitted to seeing her. Understand what that road was. 2 lanes of patched asphalt between walls of standing corn, ditches on both sides. No streetlights, no houses for a mile at a stretch, just the Brandt fence line running along the north side, and the sky going the color of dishwater overhead. Laura had ridden it more than 1,000 times. Somewhere around 5:33, she reached the mouth of the Brandt farm lane. The grain truck was parked there, angled toward the road. A man she half recognized, the hired hand from the Brandt place, polite, familiar, part of the landscape, stood beside it looking worried. What he said to her, no one would know for 34 years. A barn cat's litter, trapped in the culvert under the lane. Kittens crying where he couldn't reach. Would she help? She was a girl who wanted to spend her life saving animals. She got off her bike. She leaned it against the fence, careful, the way she did everything. And in the time it takes to pour a cup of coffee, Laura Jean Hartman evaporated from the face of the earth. No struggle, no sound, no skid mark, no torn cloth, no dropped shoe. 1 minute a girl on a road she had known her whole life. The next minute, an empty road. At 5:52, the rain finally came, soft and steady, washing the gravel, the grass, the fence rail, everything. At 6 o'clock, Ruth put supper in the oven and looked at the clock. Laura was late. Laura was never late. At 6:30, Ruth called Yoder's Market and was told Laura had left at 5:15. At 7, Elmer took the truck out in the rain and drove the road toward town, wipers slapping, headlights crawling along the ditches. At 7:30, his lights caught something against the Brandt fence, the blue Schwinn, standing neatly, beaded with rain. Her school bag lay in the wet grass 3 feet away, books still inside, shoebox money untouched at home. Elmer stood in the rain calling his daughter's name into the corn until his voice gave out. At 8:05, Ruth's shaking fingers dialed the sheriff. Sheriff Dale McKinnon was 44 years old and had spent his whole career in a county where the worst crime was a stolen combine. He stood on that dark road with his flashlight on the bicycle and felt the ground shift under his feet. There was no crime scene. There was no anything. Just a bike, a bag, the rain, and the silence of 10,000 acres of corn. By midnight, there were 40 men walking the fields with lanterns. By morning, there were 400. it was already too late. Laura Hartman was already 300 miles away, and the tragedy that would split two families' lives in two had only begun. The search for Laura Hartman became the largest in the history of Harlow County. 400 volunteers walked the corn in grid lines, arms length apart, day after day. Firemen dragged the quarry pond, divers went into the creek. A National Guard helicopter swept the fields, while men on horseback rode the fence lines and women filled the church basement with coffee and casseroles and prayers. Tracking dogs were brought in from Columbus on the second day. They took Laura's scent from her pillow, ran straight to the bicycle, circled the gravel at the mouth of the Brant farm lane, and stopped. Right at the edge of the road, the trail simply ended, as if the sky had reached down and taken her. The handlers knew what that meant. She had gotten into a vehicle. Sheriff McKinnon started where every investigator starts, close to home. Elmer and Ruth were questioned gently and cleared quickly. Then came Danny Kowalski, the boyfriend, 18 years old, a senior, with a Letterman jacket and a class ring he had been planning to give Laura at homecoming. For 3 days the county whispered his name, but Danny had been in the school film room with the varsity football coaches from 4 until 8 that evening, watching game tape with 11 witnesses. His alibi was airtight. It didn't matter. Something in the town's eyes never fully came off him. Danny Kowalski would graduate, drift, and leave Harlow Creek for good in 1990, the first life ruined by a crime he had nothing to do with. Deputies knocked on every door along County Road 9. At the Brant farm, they spoke to Amos, who stood in his doorway fighting his stutter, twisting his cap in his hands, and managed to say he had seen nothing, heard nothing, been in the barn with a sick heifer. They also spoke, briefly, to the hired man. Carl Jessup was calm and helpful, said he had knocked off work before 5 and driven to Mansfield to look at a used truck. Nobody could confirm it, but nobody could contradict it either. And there was nothing on the man, no record anyone found that fall, no reason to hold him. He was a hired hand at the end of harvest, one of hundreds moving through the county. 2 weeks later the work was done, and Carl Jessup was gone, and no one thought about him again for 34 years. What no one knew was that he did not go far. He had somewhere to be. Somewhere in the hills of West Virginia, behind a locked door, someone was waiting for him to come back. The tips poured in that first month, then trickled, then stopped. A girl matching Laura's description at a truck stop in Toledo. A blue bicycle, the wrong blue, in a barn 2 counties over. A psychic from Dayton who saw water. Every lead was chased, every lead died. October became November. The corn came down, and the fields lay bare and black under the first snow, and the searchers could finally see for miles in every direction, and there was nothing to see. By Christmas of 1988, the FBI had come and gone. The flyers on the courthouse square had begun to curl at the corners, and Sheriff McKinnon was standing in his office at midnight staring at a map with a hole in the middle of it. No body, no witness, no suspect, no trace. Just a bicycle, a school bag, and a family learning that the worst thing in the world is not an answer. It is a question that never stops asking itself. The case of Laura Jean Hartman was 6 weeks old, and it was already going cold. And in the white farmhouse on County Road 9, in the room off the summer kitchen, something had happened in early December that would have blown the case wide open, if anyone on earth had known. When a town cannot find an answer, it will build one. And Harlow Creek built its answer out of the nearest strange thing it had, the silent bachelor whose fence line Laura's bicycle had been leaning against. It started as a murmur in the diner. It always does. Why did the dog stop at his lane? Why does a man live alone like that? Why does he stumble over his own words when the deputies come around? In the spring of 1989, an anonymous tip, 3 words scrawled on a postcard, "Check the Brant place," gave the sheriff cause to do what the town demanded. They searched Amos Brant's farm from cellar to hayloft with dogs and shovels. They walked his fields. They pumped his pond. They moved through his kitchen, past a half-finished wall of fresh plaster in a sagging old house full of half-finished repairs, and thought nothing of it, because lime and plaster hold no scent, and guilt does not glow in the dark. They found nothing, because the thing they were looking for was not there, and the thing they were not looking for was 3 feet away behind New Lath. The search cleared him legally and convicted him socially. From that day, Amos Brant was the man who did it. Kids dared each other to run up and touch his porch. Someone shot out his mailbox. Someone painted the word murderer across his barn in letters 4 feet tall, and he painted over it, stuttering to no one, and never called the sheriff, because who would come? For the Hartmans, the years became a country all its own. the country of ambiguous loss, where you cannot bury your child, and you cannot set a place for her either. If you have ever lived in that terrible limbo between desperate hope and crushing grief, you know it is not a chapter of a life, it becomes the life. Hope stops being a feeling and becomes an act of endurance. Ruth kept Laura's room exactly as it was left, the homecoming dress never worn, the shoebox of savings on the dresser, the veterinary brochures on the desk. She washed the curtains every spring. She baked a pie every June 3rd and set it on the table and could not eat it. Elmer walked. That was his way. Watched him take his flashlight out after supper and walk the fields. Watched him walk the creek in waders every low-water August. Watched him grow gray and bent and keep walking. 20 years of walking, as if his daughter were a drop tool he could find if he covered every inch of ground one more time. In 1994, hope came back just long enough to draw blood. A convict named Ray Lund, serving time in Michigan, confessed to killing Laura Hartman. For 9 days, Ruth did not sleep. Then his details fell apart. The wrong road, the wrong jacket, a date he got from a newspaper, and Lund recanted, having enjoyed the attention. Ruth described those 9 days as being shattered twice, once by the news and once by its absence. The 10th anniversary came with candles on the courthouse square and an age-progressed photograph of a woman in her late 20s that Ruth could not recognize as anyone she knew. The 15th anniversary came and went with a paragraph in the paper. In November 2004, Amos Brandt died alone in the white farmhouse, unclaimed and unmourned, still the town's monster, and the case's only living witness went into the ground with everything he knew. And in March of 2009, Elmer Hartman's heart gave out in the machine shed, where he had made a brass sparrow for his daughter's wrist. He died without an answer. Ruth stood at his grave and made him one promise. Someone in this family would live long enough to know. The Brandt farm sat empty for 16 years. No heirs came forward. The estate tangled itself in probate, the fields were leased out, and the white farmhouse stood alone at the end of its lane, paint peeling, porch sagging, windows going dark one cracked pane at a time. Teenagers said it was haunted. For once, the teenagers were right. In the autumn of 2020, the county finally cleared the title and put the farm up for auction, and a young couple from Columbus, named Tyler and Megan Rusk, bought 80 acres and a dying farmhouse for less than the price of a city condo. They knew the stories. The realtor was legally obligated to say nothing, and the neighbors were morally obligated to say everything. A girl disappeared by that fence in the 80s. The old man who lived there did it. Everyone knows. They just never proved it. The Rusks were not from Harlow Creek. To them it was sad history, not open wound. They moved in with a wood stove and a renovation budget and started bringing the house back one room at a time. By March they had reached the summer kitchen, the little attached room at the back with its own staircase and its strange lumpy north wall, plastered thicker than any other wall in the house, patched and painted over so many times it bulged like a scar. On the morning of March 9, 2021, Tyler Rusk swung his sledgehammer into that wall. The plaster cracked, the lath splintered, and the darkness behind it gave up what it had held for 32 years. A skull, bones, folded knees to chest between the studs, scraps of rotted denim, and near the finger bones a chain bracelet, green with age, carrying one small charm, a brass sparrow. Tyler did not know what the sparrow meant. Every soul in Harlow Creek over the age of 40 knew exactly what it meant. It had been on every flyer, in every newspaper story, described in Ruth Hartman's trembling voice on the evening news in 1988. My husband made it for her 16th birthday. She never takes it off. Within an hour, the lane was full of cruisers. Within a day, the county had its answer. The answer it had believed for 3 decades, now apparently confirmed in bone and plaster. Laura had been in the Brandt house all along. The dogs had walked past her. The searchers had stood in that kitchen in '89. The monster was the monster after all, and he had died peacefully in the very house where he had sealed that poor girl into the wall. The town wept and raged and told itself it had been right, and a deputy drove out on County Road 9 to tell a 79-year-old widow they believed her daughter had been found. Ruth Hartman sat very still at her kitchen table, holding photographs of a girl in a red and black flannel jacket, and after 33 years of begging God for an answer, she learned that answers have a weight of their own. She called the funeral home. She chose a plot beside Elmer's. She asked the pastor to hold the service in June, near Laura's birthday, when it would be warm. The whole county planned to come. 5 months passed while the remains lay in the medical examiner's office in Columbus, waiting their turn for testing. 5 months of grief, of casseroles on Ruth's porch, of editorials about the case everyone had finally solved. Then, in August of 2021, the medical examiner picked up the phone and called Sheriff McKinnon's successor and said a sentence that stopped the funeral, reopened the case, and turned everything Harlow Creek knew upside down. The remains in the wall were not Laura Hartman. They were not a woman at all. The bones belonged to a man, an adult male, somewhere between 30 and 45 years old, 5'10", dead since roughly the winter of 1988 into 89. His neck had been broken, a clean fracture of the second vertebra, the kind of injury a fall onto stairs can cause. His knuckles carried old, healed fractures, the hands of a man who had been in fights before. He had been folded into the wall cavity deliberately, sealed behind new lath and plaster by someone who had taken his time and done careful work. And in the rotted denim jacket buried with him were two objects: Laura Hartman's Sparrow bracelet and a cardboard matchbook from the Teeter Motor Lodge in Webster Springs, West Virginia. When the news broke, Harlow Creek simply stopped. For 5 months, the town had grieved a murdered girl and cursed a dead man's name with fresh conviction. Now there was a nameless dead man inside the murderer's wall, wearing the missing girl's bracelet, and not one part of the story anyone had told for 30 years could explain him. If Amos Brandt had killed Laura, who was this? If this man had Laura's bracelet, where was Laura? And if Laura was not in the wall, then for the first time since 1988, there was a real, breathing question no one had dared to ask out loud in decades. What if she never died at all? The Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation's Cold Case Unit took over within the week, led by Detective Sergeant Maya Okafor, a methodical investigator with a reputation for solving cases by reading paper nobody else would read. Her first phone call was to a 77-year-old retired sheriff named Dale McKinnon, who had kept a copy of the Hartman file in his home office for 33 years, because he could never quite let it go. He was at the farmhouse by morning. For Ruth Hartman, now 80 years old, the news was a resurrection and a torment at once. The funeral was canceled. The plot beside Elmer stayed empty. The county that had cried with her in March did not know what to say to her in August. And late at night, alone in her kitchen, Ruth allowed herself to think a thought she had spent decades teaching herself not to think. Because hope, at her age, was the most dangerous thing left. If that is not my daughter in the wall, then nobody on this earth has ever found my daughter's body. Investigators started with the only witness left, the house itself. The plasterwork dated the wall to the winter of '88, and only one man had plastered it. Amos Brandt, the recluse the town had convicted 1,000 times over, had unquestionably sealed a corpse into his own kitchen. But the coroner's finding complicated everything, because the dead man's injuries told a story less like an execution and more like a fight, a fall, a panic. And the bracelet in the dead man's pocket whispered the most haunting possibility of all, that somewhere in the winter of 1988, in that little room off the summer kitchen, the silent man everyone hated and the invisible man nobody remembered had collided in the dark over a girl one of them had taken. The question was which one? To answer it, investigators would need to do something that had never been possible in 1988. They would need to make a skeleton say its own name. In the next part, we're going to discover something incredible: the identity of the man in the wall and the trail he left across 3 states. If you want to know what happened next, like this video and share it with someone who loves true stories. Because what this investigation uncovered is the kind of truth no one could have invented. The bones went to a forensic genealogy lab in the spring of 2022. Scientists drew DNA from the leg bone, built a profile, and uploaded it to the public databases where millions of ordinary people had submitted their own cheek swabs to learn about their family trees. Within weeks, the lab had a hit. A second cousin in Indiana, who had mailed in a kit one Christmas, never imagining it would one day pull a skeleton out of an Ohio wall and give it back its name. Genealogists worked the family tree branch by branch, marriage records, obituaries, census pages, until every line converged on one man who had walked out of the world in December of 1988 and never been reported missing by a single living soul: Carl Dean Jessup. Born 1951 in Indiana, a seasonal harvest hand who drifted from farm to farm across the Midwest with a footlocker and no fixed address. The kind of man who could vanish and leave not one ripple, because there was no one anywhere waiting for him to come home. And buried in a courthouse file in Indiana, Detective Okafor found the record that turned a name into a suspect. In 1979, Carl Jessup had been arrested for attempting to lure a 15-year-old girl into his truck outside a county fairground. The charge had been dropped, the witness's family unwilling to put a child through a trial, and the arrest had simply gone to sleep in a filing cabinet, 9 years before Laura Hartman got off her bicycle to save a litter of kittens that never existed. Then came the paper. In the probate boxes from the Brandt estate, untouched since 2004, investigators found Amos Brandt's farm ledger, and in it, in careful pencil, an entry from the autumn of 1988. C. Jessup, harvest wages. And through that entry, a single hard line, scratched deep enough to tear the page, dated December. A debt canceled, a name crossed out of the world. Piece by piece, the winter of 1988 rebuilt itself. Carl Jessup had worked that harvest at the Brandt farm and slept in the back room off the summer kitchen. He had watched Laura pass the fence every evening. He had taken her on October 14th and hidden her far away, and then he had made one final trip back to Ohio for his wages and his footlocker. And sometime in the weeks between, Amos Brandt had gone into that back room, perhaps to gather a departed worker's things, and found something under the cot that stopped his heart. A charm bracelet with a brass sparrow. Every flyer in the county carried a picture of it. Amos knew exactly what he was holding, and exactly what it meant about the man who had slept 20 feet from his own bed. What happened on the summer kitchen stairs when Carl came back, no living person witnessed. The evidence says there was a fight. The evidence says a 37-year-old man with fighter's hands went at a 55-year-old farmer, and that the younger man went down the stairs and broke his neck, and the older man lived. And then Amos Brandt, a stuttering recluse whose own town already whispered that he was a monster, stood over the body of Laura Hartman's abductor with her bracelet in his pocket and made his choice. Not the telephone, the trowel. He was paralyzed by fear of a simple truth. No one would believe him, so he sealed Carl Jessup into the north wall, and with him, sealed away the only mind on earth that knew where Laura was. The man who could have brought her home said nothing for 16 years, and then died, and the silence held, until the sledgehammer. Now let this story tell you the part only one person alive could tell. On October 14, 1988, a girl got off her bicycle because a familiar, worried man said kittens were trapped in a culvert and crying. She knelt at the mouth of the pipe. She heard nothing, and by the time she turned to say so, the world had already closed around her like a hand. Carl Jessup put her in the cab of the grain truck and drove east into the rain, while 400 people were still finding their flashlights. Sometime after midnight, on a logging road deep in the hills of Webster County, West Virginia, he opened the door of a one-room hunting cabin with a padlock on the outside, and Laura Hartman's captivity began. He never beat her. He did something worse. He went to work on the inside of her. He was calm, patient, almost fatherly, and day after day he built her a new reality, one brick of poison at a time, until home became fragments she was taught to distrust. Her mother's voice, the porch light, the smell of cut corn. He told her he had telephoned her parents. He told her he had asked for money, a fair price, he called it, and that her father had refused. He told her that her mother had said, on the phone, in words he repeated until Laura could hear them in her sleep, "That girl is the Lord's problem now." And then he showed her the proof. A newspaper clipping, creased and smudged, reporting that the search for Laura Hartman had been called off after 3 days at her family's request. It looked real. It was not. It was pasted, typed, and photocopied, forged by a man who understood that a 17-year-old far from home does not need chains if you can convince her that no one wants her back. If you have ever believed, even for 1 hour, that the people you love had let go of you, then you know a fraction of what settled over that girl in the dark of that cabin, and you know how the lie did the locking better than the padlock ever could. In late November, Carl told her he had business to finish and would be back in 4 days. He left food, water, and the padlock. He drove to Ohio for his wages and his footlocker, and on a farmhouse staircase 2 miles from Laura's bedroom, his neck was broken by the last man on earth anyone would have suspected of defending her. Carl Jessup was sealed into a wall with her bracelet in his pocket. And in West Virginia, a 17-year-old girl sat alone in a locked cabin, waiting for a monster who was never coming back. 4 days passed, then 5, then 6. The food ran out, the nights went below freezing, and Laura Hartman, who had wanted to spend her life saving trapped and frightened animals, saved one. She broke the window with the iron skillet, cut her hands climbing through, and walked 11 miles of logging road in tennis shoes and a flannel jacket until she reached a paved road, where an elderly widow named Pearl Givens found her at the edge of the headlights, half-frozen, hollow-eyed, and silent. Pearl asked her name, and here is the moment that split the next 33 years in two. Laura believed the clipping, believed the phone call, believed she was the Lord's problem now. So she did not say Laura, she said Anne. Pearl Givens took her in, fed her, asked few questions, and concluded she had run from bad people in Ohio, which was, in its way, the truth. And Laura Jean Hartman, alive, free, and 300 miles from a mother who was praying for her by name every single night, chose the cruelest mercy she could think of. She disappeared on purpose. The girl called Anne grew into a woman one quiet year at a time. She stayed with Pearl Givens until the old widow passed in 1997, then drifted south to Asheville, North Carolina, where nobody asked where anyone was from. She taught herself bookkeeping. She married a gentle carpenter named Sam Carter in 1995 and buried him, far too early, in 2018. She raised a son, Michael, born in 1996, who grew up believing his mother's family in Ohio had cast her out young, because that was the only story she had ever been given to tell. She kept one thing from before, a folded square of newsprint in the back of her Bible, soft as cloth from handling, the clipping that said her family had stopped looking. Whenever the ache came, and it came for 33 years, she would unfold it, read it, and put her old life back in the drawer. In September of 2022, the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation held a press conference that went out on every network in America, because the story had everything: a skeleton in a farmhouse wall, a wrongly hated recluse, a predator identified by his own family tree, and a bombshell final line. Investigators now believe Laura Hartman may still be alive. On the screens behind them, they put up two images: her junior year photograph, the braid, the gray-green eyes, and beside it, an age progression of a woman in her 50s. That night, in a small house in Asheville, a 51-year-old bookkeeper named Anne Carter turned on the news to fall asleep to, and sat up in the dark, staring at her own face. She watched the story 3 times. She learned, in the space of 9 minutes, that the man who took her had been dead since the week she was waiting for him in the cabin, that her parents had never been called, never refused a ransom, never stopped searching, that 400 people had walked the corn for her, that her father had walked the fields with a flashlight for 20 years and died walking, that her mother was 80 years old, still in the farmhouse, still keeping her room, and that the clipping in her Bible, the load-bearing wall of her entire life, was a forgery. 33 years of guilt, of shame, of believing herself unwanted, all of it had rested on one man's forgery, and everything she had built her silence on collapsed in a single evening. She sat with the clipping unfolded in front of her and made the decision she had been too wounded to make at 17. At 11:40 that night, September 30th, 2022, the BCI tip line recorded a call from a North Carolina number. The voice on the recording is quiet, steady, and broken all at once. "You can stop looking for Laura Hartman. I'm her. I've been her the whole time. I need someone to tell my mother I'm sorry." Detective Okafor flew to Asheville within 2 days. The woman across the table knew things no imposter could know: the name of the barn cat, the joke Mrs. Pfeiffer told about coffee, the weight of a brass sparrow on a wrist. But after Ray Lund, after 34 years of false hope, no one would carry anything less than certainty to Ruth Hartman's door. A cheek swab went to the lab under emergency priority. The match came back at 99.9%. Anne Carter of Asheville, North Carolina, was Laura Jean Hartman of Harlow Creek, Ohio. Okafor and Dale McKinnon drove out County Road 9 together, past the fence line, past the white farmhouse, and parked in the gravel where a blue Schwinn once leaned. The old sheriff insisted on being the one to knock. Ruth opened the door, saw his face, and gripped the frame with both hands. "Ruth," he said, and his voice failed him twice before it worked. "She's alive." They met on a Tuesday in October of 2022, in a quiet conference room at the Bureau of Criminal Investigation in Columbus, because a farmhouse kitchen felt like too much for a first meeting between a mother and her own flesh and blood. Ruth arrived an hour early in her church dress, holding her purse in her lap with both hands. When the door opened, a 51-year-old woman stood in it, gray threaded through brown hair, no braid, lines around gray-green eyes. Not the girl from the flyers, not the age progression. A stranger, wearing her daughter's face the way a field in November wears the shape of summer. Nobody had to say a word for the hardest truth in the room to be understood. This was not the fairy tale. Laura had no amnesia. She had not forgotten her mother for 33 years. She had remembered her every single day and stayed away because a dead man's lie had taught her she was not wanted. There are wounds in this story, but that one may be the deepest. A daughter grieving a mother who was alive, a mother grieving a daughter who was alive, 2 women robbed of each other by a forged scrap of newsprint. Laura had rehearsed a speech, It did not survive the doorway. What came out instead was the sentence she had carried since the cabin. You didn't stop looking. And Ruth, 80 years old, stood up out of her chair and answered the question underneath it. Not for one single day. They held each other for a long time, and it was not simple, and it was not clean. And anyone who tells you such moments heal everything has never lived one. If you have ever gotten back something you had already grieved, you know that joy and loss can arrive in the same heartbeat, and that finding someone is not the same as getting them back. The weeks that followed were tender and terrible by turns. Laura learned her father was in the ground 13 years, and the guilt nearly folded her in half. He walked the fields for you, Ruth told her, and then, seeing what it did, spent months teaching them both a gentler grammar. He never believed you were gone. He would have liked knowing he was right. Laura gave the investigators the forged clipping from the back of her Bible, and forensic document examiners confirmed what she could not have known at 17. A paste-up job, 2 typefaces, a fiction. She wept when they told her, not because she needed the proof, but because some part of her had spent 3 decades afraid the clipping was real, and the rescue story was the lie. Ruth met her grandson Michael, 26 years old, a stranger with Elmer's exact way of standing in a doorway with his cap in his hand. Ruth fed him pie, and stared at him, and laughed and cried in the same breath. There were hard rooms to walk through. Laura stood in her childhood bedroom, unchanged since 1988, the homecoming dress still on its hanger, and had to leave twice before she could stay. She drove County Road 9 at a crawl with her knuckles white on the wheel. She stood a long time at her father's grave, and what she said there stayed there. And one afternoon, she asked to be taken to the white farmhouse, walked into the summer kitchen where the wall stood open to the studs, and looked for a long, silent minute at the place where the man who stole her life had spent 32 years hidden, 20 feet from the room where he had watched her ride past. It doesn't feel like justice, she finally said. It feels like weather, something that happened to all of us at once. There was one more debt to pay, and Harlow Creek paid it in the spring of 2023. On a mild Saturday in May, the town gathered on the courthouse square, the same square where Laura's flyers had curled and faded, for a ceremony nobody would have believed 2 years earlier. The county formally cleared the name of Amos Brandt. The investigation's conclusion was read aloud. That Amos had discovered the bracelet and confronted Laura's abductor. That he had fought a younger, stronger man on his own stairs and survived. That his terrible silence afterward was the choice of a frightened man convicted in advance by his neighbors, not the act of a monster. The town that had painted a word on his barn stood quietly and listened to what it had done. He fought the man who took her, the pastor said, and we spent 16 years making sure that if he ever wanted to tell someone, there was no one in this county he could trust to hear it. His silence cost this family everything. So did ours. Afterward, Ruth Hartman asked to be driven to the small cemetery where Amos Brandt lay under a flat stone no one had ever visited, and the cameras stayed back as an 81-year-old woman laid flowers on the grave of the man she had cursed for half her life. Nobody heard what she said either. Some words are only for the dead. Laura kept her name, in the end, both of them. Ann Carter on her mail, Laura on her mother's lips, and she answered to each without flinching, because both women were real, and both had survived. She drives up from Asheville every month now, visits that were bittersweet at first, and are slowly becoming simply sweet. She has learned the farmhouse kitchen again, where the flower lives, which floorboard groans, how her mother takes her coffee. On June 3, 2023, Ruth baked the birthday pie she had baked alone for 34 years, and for the first time since 1988, someone was there to eat it. 2 plates, 2 forks. 52 candles would not fit, so they lit one, and it was enough. Laura spoke publicly only once, at a conference for the families of the missing, with her mother in the front row and her son beside her. She did not talk long. She said that chains had held her for 6 weeks, but a lie had held her for 33 years. She said, if somebody made you believe you are not wanted, not missed, not worth searching for, ask again, ask out loud, because somewhere there may be a porch light that never once went dark. Every case this channel tells you ends with a lesson, and this one has 3. Rumors buried an innocent man alive. Silence sealed the truth in a wall. And one manufactured lie kept a living daughter from a living mother for 3 decades, when a single phone call, on any night of any year, would have ended it. Hold your people close, and make sure they never have to wonder whether you would look for them. They should know it the way they know the sun will rise. Share this video. Not for morbidity, but to create awareness about the thousands of missing persons whose families are still waiting, still walking the fields, still baking pies for empty chairs. Somewhere tonight, someone who vanished decades ago is still alive, still believing a lie about the people who love them. Maybe this story reaches them. Maybe it reaches you. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Subscribe so you never miss a case. And keep your porch light on. Because a wall in Ohio held its secret for 32 years, and the truth still got out. Because a mother waited 34 years, and her daughter still came home. Because sometimes, miracles do happen.